The man who refers to himself as Thor, Jason Pirate Software Hall, is currently watching the ground collapse beneath him. In the span of just 2 weeks between late June and early July 2025, his YouTube channel has lost hundreds of thousands of subscribers, an issue that could have perhaps been prevented if he only had a bit more manner or shown some sort of remorse for intentionally misleading the public regarding the Stop Killing Games movement. What could have been an opportunity for measured damage control instead turned into a defining moment of defiance. When a viewer suggested he issue an apology to repair his public image, Hall's response on stream was cutting and contemptuous. He would proceed to tell his audience, and the world for that matter, that he didn't give a f*** and would tell us to all eat shit. This would end up being a soundbite that dominated gaming news cycles, becoming shorthand for a creator seemingly intent on burning what goodwill remained. But when we look at the broader picture, this was no isolated slip or ill-tempered outburst. It was the culmination of a string of controversies that had been steadily eroding his reputation for years. No longer seen as a candid voice, Hall increasingly has become viewed as hostile, defensive, and unwilling to learn from his mistakes. The audience that once celebrated his blunt honesty now sees someone who talks down to his fans, escalating every minor dispute and seeming incapable of stepping away from confrontation. But of course, this isn't the first time we've watched a well-known indie game developer detonate their own career in public, and the last time it ended in disaster. As before Pirate Software, there was Phil Fish, and it ended very badly. Phil Fish, born Philippe Poisson in 1984 in Montreal, Quebec, grew up with a deep love of gaming, heavily influenced by playing titles like The Legend of Zelda with his father, who translated the game into French so they could enjoy it together. Encouraged by his parents to pursue creative endeavours, he developed an early passion for art and design, which eventually led him to study at the Montreal National Animation and Design Centre, graduating in 2004 with a focus on digital art for video games. After brief stints at Ubisoft Montreal, where he worked on Open Season, and Artificial Minds Movement, where he contributed to The Golden Compass, Fish grew frustrated with the restrictive nature of the big studios. This pushed him towards the indie scene, where he co-founded the experimental game collective Kokoromi, organised the Gamma events, and began working on what would become his most well-known project, Fez. By 2008, he had founded his own studio, Polytron Corporation, leaving behind the mainstream industry to bring his creative vision to life, a decision that ultimately led to the release and critical success of Fez in 2012. Yet, despite this promising start, Fish's meteoric rise would soon give way to a series of explosive controversies and personal battles that would see his career unravel in ways few could have predicted, leaving behind a disastrous trail that still fascinates the gaming world. While figures like Jason Hall and Phil Fish are chronically annoying, do you know what isn't annoying? Getting huge discounts on all the best modern games. I've got huge discounts available right now on all of the must-play titles from the last 12 months. We're talking Stellar Blade, Expedition 33, Black Myth Wukong, and even a jaw-droppingly gorgeous Wu Chang Fallen Feathers released this week. So if you're tired of AAA garbage and want the good stuff without breaking the bank, click my links down below and grab a bargain. Phil Fish's rise coincided with a pivotal moment in gaming history when digital platforms like Steam, Xbox Live Arcade, and PlayStation Network were transforming the way independent developers could reach audiences. In the early 2010s, the market was saturated with sequels and formulaic blockbusters, creating a space for smaller studios to challenge the industry's creative stagnation. Indie games, once dismissed as niche curiosities, were now seen as a testing ground for bold experimentation and personal storytelling. Fish's debut title, Fez, became emblematic of this new wave. A lot of people really enjoyed Fez. After all, it was a meticulous puzzle platformer that married retro-inspired pixel art with an innovative rotation mechanic, inviting players to shift the entire game world to uncover new dimensions. Critics hailed Fez not only for its elegant design, but for the way it asked players to rethink what two-dimensional spaces could achieve. But behind the acclaim and accolades, tensions were already brewing. Whispers of public clashes, volatile opinions, and a growing storm of online hostility that would soon turn Phil Fish from an indie darling into one of gaming's most divisive figures. The making of Fez was as much of a story as the game itself, immortalised by the 2012 documentary Indie Game, the movie. Fish's presence in the film was both captivating and raw. Unlike the polished, PR-trained faces that dominated gaming culture, he appeared vulnerable and visibly burdened by years of setbacks. His battles with a former business partner has become legal quagmires, delaying Fez for years, and his obsessive perfectionism pushed him to the brink of burnout. The film showed Fish at his most human, moments of elation at his progress followed almost immediately by anxiety and doubt. His candidness about the emotional strain of independent development struck a chord with viewers who saw him as a creator both uncompromising and deeply relatable. Much like the previous modern-day fascination with Pirate Software's charismatic presence on YouTube Shorts, Fish's outspoken nature made him a figurehead for indie rebellion, but much like Pirate Software, his confrontational streak would ultimately prove as polarizing as it was compelling. Internet users would quickly begin to note Fish's refusal to ever soften his opinions or adopt a more diplomatic tone, making him a divisive figure. Supporters saw authenticity, detractors saw arrogance. So by the time Fez launched to critical acclaim, Fish was not just a game developer, but a cultural figurehead, simultaneously celebrated as a pioneer of indie creativity and viewed as a lightning rod for controversy in an industry still learning how quickly social media could amplify every unguarded comment. In fact, by 2012, Phil Fish's notoriety was growing as fast as his reputation for brilliant game design. That year, following a screening of Indie Game the Movie at the Game Developers Conference, Fish participated in a Q&A where a Japanese developer asked what he thought of modern Japanese games. Fish didn't hesitate or try to come up with a diplomatic answer. Instead, he told them, "Your games just suck." The reaction was explosive. Outlets like Eurogamer, Kotaku and Gamatsu reported extensively on the comment. Eurogamer called it a moment that divided opinion, dismissed by some as an offhand jab, but seen by others as cultural arrogance directed at an industry with a long and storied legacy. Polygon noted that the moment cemented the image of Fish as an industry maverick with no filter, someone willing to provoke outrage as easily as praise. To give context to his comments, back in 2012, the narrative that Japanese games sucked didn't emerge in a vacuum. The late 2000s and early 2010s marked a turbulent era for Japanese game development, as many studios struggled to adapt to HD consoles, new engines, and Western expectations for online connectivity and cinematic storytelling. Franchises like Resident Evil, Final Fantasy, and Silent Hill were undergoing awkward transitions that left even long-time fans feeling alienated, while Western studios, particularly those under publishers like EA, Activision and Bethesda, were pumping out blockbuster titles with bigger budgets, cutting-edge visuals, and Hollywood-style narratives. When Phil Fish famously echoed this sentiment during a panel at GDC 2012, it resonated with a lot of players who were already frustrated with what they saw as Japan's stagnation. Ironically, a decade later, the roles have reversed. Western AAA gaming is now criticized for corporate bloat, microtransactions, and creative bankruptcy, while Japanese studios, from Capcom's offerings and Square Enix's rebirth to From Software's global dominance, are celebrated as the last bastions of innovation and quality. Still, since Phil's comments clearly ruffled feathers, Fish attempted to clarify his comment in follow-up interviews, explaining that he loved classic Japanese games but felt the modern scene was stagnant. But by then, the internet had already decided what the moment meant. What began as a snarky retort was now reframed as a symbol of Fish's arrogance and a reminder that his candor often came across as cruelty. His public persona, which he would come to be remembered by, was taking shape before our very eyes. At another GDC event, Fish doubled down on his combative posture. He told attendees, "I am this close to not talking to press ever again because I am fucking sick of being asked stupid questions by people who do not actually play games and don't know what they're talking about." The press took note, and so did his critics. His comment was so divisive because it cut to the heart of a long-standing tension between developers, the gaming press, and players. On one hand, many gamers agreed with Phil Fish, feeling that much of the mainstream gaming media at the time, and still today for that matter, were out of touch with the actual player experience, often prioritizing sensationalism or shallow coverage over genuine insights. His bluntness resonated with players who were tired of seeing developers dance around hollow PR narratives and felt that someone needed to say what everyone was thinking. But on the other hand, his statement once again came across as arrogant and hostile to critics, especially journalists, who saw it as an unfair generalization that dismissed the entire industry. Fish's combative tone, unfiltered and unapologetic, drew admiration from some, while others viewed it as unprofessional and emblematic of a growing divide between indie creators and the press. However, if 2012 was the beginning of trouble, 2013 saw Fish's public image truly unravel. In July, Marcus Beer, a journalist for Game Trailers, criticised both Fish and fellow indie developer Jonathan Blow on Invisible Walls for refusing to comment on Microsoft's Xbox One indie policies. Beer called them hipster arseholes and branded Fish a tosspot who saw himself as above the gaming press. This incident was incredibly divisive because it amplified existing tensions between outspoken indie developers and the traditional gaming media. Some gamers sided with Marcus Beer, viewing Fish's refusal to comment as evidence of an inflated ego and a lack of professionalism, especially when paired with his history of combative remarks. To them, Beer's rant seemed like a justified pushback against developers who they believed were basking in critical acclaim while sneering at the very press that had helped elevate their games. However, others saw Beer's attack as unnecessarily personal and emblematic of a press culture that often resented indie creators for not playing the usual PR rules. Fish's response was immediate and incendiary. On Twitter, he told Beer, "Compare your life to mine and then kill yourself." Expectedly, the backlash was swift and brutal. The Verge called it a display of raw hostility, while Forbes described it as a public meltdown rarely seen from a developer of Fish's stature. The line became a scarlet letter, a quote that would follow him long after the moment had passed. But the fallout didn't stop at criticism. Mere hours after the tweet, Fish cancelled Fez 2. "I'm done. Fez 2 is cancelled. Goodbye." The gaming press scrambled. Polygon called it a meltdown in real time, while Kotaku argued the cancellation wasn't about the game itself, but rather the mental and emotional state of a developer who had finally broken under the weight of public scrutiny. At the time, Fez 2 was one of the most highly anticipated indie projects in development. Its sudden death felt symbolic not just of Fish's exhaustion, but of the limits of indie stardom in the new social media age. But things would only go from bad to worse for old Fish. In 2014, things reached their absolute lowest point. Fish's personal accounts and Polytron's websites were hacked, doxing attempts followed, and private information was leaked online. Some online communities celebrated the attack, seeing them as just desserts for his perceived arrogance. Fish's final posts during this period were bitter and final. He announced that he would be selling the Fez intellectual property and stepping away from the games industry permanently. As Polygon put it, the most celebrated indie developer of his generation had gone from visionary to recluse in just 2 years, undone as much by his own volatility as by the relentless antagonism of the internet. Through each flashpoint, the GDC comment, the Marcus Beer feud, the Fez 2 cancellation, the hacks, the image of Fish hardened. He was no longer seen as a gifted but eccentric developer. He was, as The Verge summarized, a meltdown waiting to happen. By 2014, Phil Fish's relationship with the gaming industry had reached an irretrievable low point. The combination of relentless online harassment, highly public feuds, and his own unfiltered responses had left him exhausted and disillusioned. What had begun as a celebrated narrative of indie success had curdled into a cautionary tale about the dangers of living in the digital spotlight. The industry that once lauded Fish as a voice for creative independence now felt to him like a hostile environment, one where every word he spoke was weaponized against him and every misstep amplified beyond proportion. Phil announced that he would be cutting every tie that bound him to the scene that had simultaneously made him famous and worn him down. It was a departure that felt final, like the closing of a door that would never again be opened. Fish's exit, however, did not quiet the conversation around him. If anything, his departure became a talking point that reverberated through the industry, forcing both fans and commentators to reflect on what his rise and fall said about modern gaming culture. Later that year, the release of the widely discussed video essay "This is Phil Fish" reframed his story, presenting him not only as the architect of his own undoing, but also as a symbol of how the internet can weaponize visibility. The video argued that Fish's downfall was less a matter of individual flaws and more the result of a system that rewards outrage and punishes creators who lack the corporate buffers and PR training of major studios. His blunt, often abrasive honesty, which had initially won him a devoted following, became the very thing that left him vulnerable in a climate that thrives on outrage cycles. Rather than excusing his behaviour, the essay dissected how he had been chewed up by a culture that delights in elevating its icons, only to revel in their eventual collapse. The cultural response to his withdrawal was deeply divided. Admirers of his work lamented the loss of a unique, creative voice, pointing to Fez as evidence of the artistry and innovation he was capable of when his energy was solely focused on his craft. To them, his departure was not a triumph over an arrogant figure, but a tragedy for indie creativity. Others, however, viewed his exit as long overdue, the inevitable conclusion of a saga that had always seemed destined to implode. Publications like Polygon and Kotaku commented that Fish's story was as much a reflection of the wider gaming culture as it was about his personal behaviour. Polygon observed that Fish's implosion was not simply about one developer's temperament, but about an industry and audience that celebrates creators one day and vilifies them the next. Fish's withdrawal, therefore, became both a personal and cultural moment of reckoning. It marked the end of an era when indie developers could ascend to a kind of celebrity status without the infrastructure or protective barriers that shield mainstream creators. His story became a stark reminder that the unfiltered authenticity which made him stand out was also what left him exposed to a culture increasingly primed to tear down anyone who dares to stand out too much or speak too loudly. So, what can we learn from all of this? Well, previously, Indie Game the Movie presented one of the most unfiltered and intimate portrayals of Phil Fish, laying bare a creator who lived and breathed his project to the point of personal collapse. Unlike the polished industry figures who carefully cultivate their public personas, Fish came across as someone whose identity was completely fused with Fez. Every line of code, every visual detail, every design decision became a reflection of him, his triumphs and his failures alike. One of the film's most striking quotes, "If I don't finish Fez, I'll kill myself. That's my incentive," was as unsettling as it was revealing. It demonstrated not only the suffocating pressure he placed on himself, but also how finishing the game had become an existential necessity rather than a professional goal. Fish's social awkwardness was apparent throughout the film, from tense hotel lobby scenes where he appeared visibly panicked to moments where he asked almost rhetorically, "Why do I care so much?" His discomfort with being in the spotlight was clear, yet his stubborn perfectionism kept dragging him into confrontations with both the press and his audience. Years of delays, legal battles with a former business partner, and the ever-increasing expectations surrounding Fez left him brittle and defensive. He internalized every criticism of his work as an attack on himself, which only deepened the adversarial dynamic between him and the public. This need for recognition and validation clashed starkly with the combative tone he projected online. While Fez earned critical acclaim for its innovation and artistry, Fish's reputation was defined just as much by his public outbursts. He was frequently described as volatile, with some observers praising his unwillingness to compromise, while others saw a little more than arrogance and hostility. As Rock Paper Shotgun once noted, Fish seemed melodramatic, theatrical and neurotic, yet brilliantly capable of bending a game to his will. It was this blend of creative brilliance and combustible personality that made him both magnetic and divisive. By the time Fez finally launched, Fish's image was already split between that of a visionary developer and that of a man teetering on the edge of self-destruction. Indie Game the Movie captured this duality with precision, showing a creator who was both fragile and fiery, someone whose genius was frequently overshadowed by his unrelenting need to be understood, validated and, above all else, vindicated. Pirate Software would do well to study Phil Fish's story as a cautionary tale of how rapid fame, unfiltered communication and constant online engagement can destroy a creator's career as easily as it can build one. Much like Fish during the Fez era, Pirate Software has built a reputation not just on their work but on their personality, a strong, outspoken presence that draws both fans and critics in equal measure. Phil Fish's downfall wasn't because Fez failed, it was a critical and commercial triumph, but because his public persona, fueled by social media clashes and combative remarks, became bigger than the game itself. By putting himself front and centre, Fish became the lightning rod for every controversy, and eventually the pressure, harassment and toxic discourse forced him to quit the industry altogether. Pirate Software now stands in a similarly precarious position, where constant exposure and direct interactions with online communities risks creating the same echo chamber of backlash that once swallowed Phil Fish whole. If Pirate Software is to avoid that fate, he needs to recognise that success in the modern gaming landscape isn't just about making great games, it's about navigating public perception carefully. The moment the audience turns on the personality rather than the product, the narrative can spiral out of control. In other words, Pirate Software should learn to pick his battles, step back when needed, and ensure his games, not his personal drama, remain the focus or risk becoming the next Phil Fish. Phil's departure was not measured or strategic, it was abrupt and final, a statement of exhaustion and defiance that made it clear that he would rather abandon his craft altogether than continue to endure the endless cycle of hostility, harassment and scrutiny from both the press and gaming community. Thor, as he likes to call himself, now stands at a similarly precarious moment, though his story is not yet set in stone. Once admired as a charismatic voice who brought the realities of game development to life for a wide audience, Hall's reputation has been chipped away by a series of controversies, from dismissive rants that alienated viewers to his handling of public backlash. His unwillingness to engage in honest self-reflection or acknowledge the impact of his own words has begun to mirror the downward trajectory of Fish, transforming a persona once viewed as refreshingly candid into one increasingly seen as combative and arrogant. Yet unlike Fish, Hall's platform has not collapsed entirely. There is still time to recalibrate, but each defiant outburst makes that possibility more distant. The question now is whether Hall can shake off the growing perception of being too stubborn and self-assured to admit his mistakes. Can he swallow his pride, acknowledge the missteps that have eroded his audience's trust, and take real action to mend those relationships? Phil Fish ultimately chose to abandon the stage altogether, walking away for good, but Hall hasn't reached that breaking point, at least not yet. He still has a chance to course correct, to prove that he can grow rather than double down before the tide of public opinion fully turns against him, but if I'm honest, I don't believe he will try to fix it.